Afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's Foundations webinar. Got a special this afternoon on adaptations for children. I'm Paul. Hi.
The Foundations webinar.
And if you haven't heard of Foundations before, we're the national body for home improvement agencies England. We're funded by the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, and we're here to help. And almost everything we do is free. So
find out more at foundations.uk.com.
So just before I hand over to Lorraine to take us through this afternoon's session, just wanted to say this is our last proper webinar of the year. So thank you to everybody who's joined us over the last 12 months. We started these out on a rainy day in January, not knowing quite what the year would be like. And we've seen thousands and thousands of people since. So thank you all for coming along and joining us on a Tuesday afternoon. Wouldn't have been the same without you. And if you've got a couple of minutes this afternoon, why don't you kind of pop in the chat what your favourite webinar of the year has been. Be interesting to hear. So this is what we've got this afternoon. So over to you, Lorraine.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul. Welcome, everybody. Today, it's the children's webinar. The aims of this webinar. I think why we're having this webinar is because home adaptations for children are actually quite small compared to adults' adaptations. They do tend to be larger and they tend to be more complex. So in this webinar, what are the aims? The aims are to really increase awareness of good practice within paediatric occupational therapy and people that are involved in DFGs. Another aim is to disseminate research findings, and Luke Clements is actually with us today, and he's been involved in research on paediatric OT stroke DFGs. He's going to be talking about his research. And what else? The other aim is that hopefully we're going to be talking about raising awareness of the future research that is going to be carried out on autism, stroke, challenging behaviour and also DFGs. Just going back to increasing good awareness of good practice, that we actually have a collection of OTs from 3 boroughs, which you're going to be seeing or you're going to be hearing very shortly. Paul, can you do the next slide, please? Okay, so just to give a little bit of context for the webinar, that what I wanted to say is the research says, and also Foundations have been involved in the research to do with DFGs and the review, but 70% of DFGs are paid to people over 60. 7% of the grants of DFGs are actually paid to people under 21, which is quite a small number, very small number, in fact. Home adaptations for young people are actually more expensive than older people. We're going to go into the whys in a minute. But what actually happens with children's DFGs is that the costs actually often exceed the maximum mandatory award. Paul, could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So just going on from the context and going on from 7% of grants are paid to people under 21, the maximum mandatory grant is often not enough, inadequate, which I'm sure you'll all be aware of. And what happens is with children's adaptations that one of the only solutions is actually to have a purpose-built extension, which obviously is expensive, which I've mentioned, can cost up to £70,000. Problem also that top-up funding from social services can be difficult to obtain. Interest-free grants, loans are difficult to obtain, which of course actually just slows down the process, which can be a long drawn-out process as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so today we have, as I've mentioned to you before, Professor Luke Clements, who's from Leeds University. We have OTs from Essex, OTs from Warwickshire, an OT from Warwickshire, and also Middlesbrough. So I'm going to hand over now to Professor Luke Clements, who's going to be telling you about his research and also future research. So Luke, over to you.
Thanks, Lorraine. Welcome, everybody. Many thanks for the invitation. Have I got, oh yes, I can share my PowerPoint. Okay. Well, hopefully everybody can see that there's just a PowerPoint slide there with disabled facilities, grants, adaptations, and the law. I've got 15 minutes to talk to, so I'll probably finish about 25 past, and there may be some time for some questions. Yeah, I run a research unit funded by a disabled children's charity at Leeds. And what I'm going to be looking at briefly is the law, because I think the law, I'm a lawyer, I'm a professor of law, but also a solicitor. And I think the law reflects this problem of that we highlighted in the research concerning cost benefits of DFGs. Now, let's see if this is still working. So if you go to my website, which I give you there, at the bottom, there's the PowerPoint, there's the link. The reason I give you that is because if you go to the left-hand publications tab and get to that, if you scroll down, the two bits of research I'm going to be talking about are accessible there. Just click and it comes down. And I'm going to talk in particular about the cost-benefit research. When we come to look at legislation on disabled facilities grants and adaptations, there tends to be a thought that this is basically a Housing Act obligation. But legally, that's not the case. The key act, if you're interested in disabled children, is the Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act, 1970. That was the act that brought in duties on local authorities, social services authorities, to provide adaptations. It was initially for all disabled people, but since the Care Act came into force, it's just restricted now to adaptations for disabled children. And once a local authority, social service authority, has decided that an adaptation is needed, it's got to provide that. And that doesn't mean necessarily a loan, it means it's got to fund it. Now, normally it will be reasonable for a local authority to ask an applicant to apply for a grant, which is now under the Housing Grants Construction and Regeneration Act. When the Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act came into force, there were no grants. I mean, grants didn't come until the Local Government Housing Act in 1989. So there's always been a duty since 1970s on local authorities to facilitate adaptations, but only grants relatively recently. If the housing grant isn't available, or if it's insufficient, because as you'll all know, it's limited in England to 30,000, the housing authority has powers to top that up. If the adaptation is for an adult, then it's not done under the Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act, it's done under the Care Act if you're social services. So you've got this mix of acts of housing and social services. And that's the point I think that needs to be really stressed, is that this legislation not only feeds into each other, and I'm giving the example of social services and housing, but it is something that is polycentric in the sense that the ripple effects of disabled facilities, grants, adaptations extend well beyond the housing shore. And the Ombudsman has frequently pointed out that it's unlawful for social services authorities to fail to appreciate that they've got duties to provide adaptations. It's not just a question of signposting somebody to the housing authority. Now, in terms of consideration, my view is that families with disabled children, their first port of call will be social services, and they will be being assessed under the Children Act and the Chronic Sick and Disabled Persons Act, or adults would be assessed under the under the Care Act. If social services decide that there is a need for adaptations, then it's quite reasonable for them, except in cases of urgency, to ask the family to make a disabled facilities grant application. If they're ineligible for that grant, or there's a top-up of over 30,000, then legally the first port of call is to go back to the local authority social services department and ask them to top it up under the Chronic Sick and Disabled Persons Act or the Children Act. And it's not because asking, they will have a duty to do that in most cases. Failing that, and only ultimately would one then rely on the discretionary power under the Regulatory Reform Act. Now, that's a sequence that I think exists in law, but in practice, I think that it's very often just focused on the housing obligations under the 96 Act and the RRO. Now, we did some research a few years back on cost effectiveness of disabled facilities grants, and we were interested in the group of children that Lorraine has talked about. These are young people with autism whose autism is connected with very serious sensory difficulties that can produce particularly challenging behavior, great difficulties for the families to cope. Families that were all in touch with not only the housing authority, but with the social services authority. What we looked at was following a series of children in that situation, young people who were waiting, their families were waiting for adaptations and for grants. And the reality is that these young people, many of them will end up looked after by the local authority. And the longer the delay in getting a grant, the more likely it was that these children would become looked after. And when they're looked after, we're talking about children that would require £2,500 or so £1,000 a week in costs from social services. And during the research, 2 of the children, the families are saying, if we don't get this within 6 months, these children will be looked after. And they didn't get the grant because of budgeting difficulties, and these children did end up looked after. So this was a sample of children going through. It's the only research I know that's looked at disabled facilities grants in young people, particularly high. And these adaptations averaged about 70,000, but some of them were considerably more than that. And this was a big unitary authority, so they had a more sort of specialized DFG process than perhaps a smaller district council would have. And that's the research that was published, and you can just download it. There is there's not a lot, but there's other research. And if any of you, I mean, I'm going to have to sign off after this, but if any of you can let Lorraine and Foundations know of research you're aware of, I'd be very interested. But research in Neath Port Talbot about 10 years ago showed that the net say that for just over £1 million expenditure, the Neath Port Talbot considered that they had saved 12.5 times that, 12.5 million in global funding for their to benefit their authority. And research undertaken by the Isle of Wight itself, actually its own housing department, showed that the net annual savings that they made from disabled facilities grants were over 13.5 million. So these are really extraordinarily significant figures. And I've never really come across anybody that has disputed that. The government certainly accept that in its in its grant, in the fact that the grants have been increased by central government. So what I'm interested in, and the reason I've written about this more recently in my most recent book, is this sort of systems analysis. What we have within local authorities is we have a housing manager with a budget, and she or he has got to stay in budget because the system boundary is drawn around the housing department. So if they make a payment of £70,000, then that's net expenditure, and that shows that their budget is £70,000 less. And once their annual budget is spent, then in a way they try and draw the line until the next year another allocation is made. But what we've shown is that if the housing budget spends 70,000, so it depletes its budget by 70,000, that was saving, on average, the Social Services Authority, and this is a unitary authority, so it was the same body, the equivalent amount that year. But of course, in the subsequent years, it would be saving the same again. So after 5 years, for one-off payment of 70,000, social services were on average £350,000 better off. But of course, the local authority carried on allocating the budget to the individual authorities, and the housing manager would be under huge pressure if she or he overspent. You could draw the system boundary between the two. And then, of course, you could have equalizing payments from social service to housing to, in a way, reward housing for saving very substantial amounts of money, to incentivize housing to actually make more disabled facilities payments because they were having a disproportionate beneficial impact on the local authority budget. So we have a system where we've just been comparing housing and social services. The payment by housing budget is making quite enormous savings for social services budget. And we see that not just for children, but for adults in the 3 bits of research I've cited, and they're the only 3 bits that I know of. But in our research, we didn't try to quantify this, but we said, you know, it's not just these 2 bodies that is having this impact. There's huge number of these children, because they didn't have space, because they were becoming very aggressive, because they didn't have sensory space. What I should have said is that the work was, as Lorraine has already said, almost always to build an extension or to create an extra space, not just a bathroom, but sensory space, sort of down space where these people could just be on their own and give themselves a break and also their family a break. If they didn't have that, there were a lot of injuries, there were a lot of traumas, and they would end up a lot in the NHS emergency. But also some of these looked after children are co-funded by the NHS, where they're very high budgets. These children were getting into trouble with the police. We could have had the criminal budget there as well. One of them kept running away, and we were trying to work out what the cost of a police helicopter was for 3 hours as it was looking for them. So the huge implications on the sort of criminal law police budget. The families largely were, none of them were working because the children needed 24/7 care, and social services were having great difficulty finding people who would cope with them in such sort of combined space, so that the family was drawing huge amounts of, significant amounts of social security because they were out of work. And of course the family was suffering terribly financial losses because that they weren't able to live ordinary lives and look after their children in an ordinary way. So these are all budgets that if you add them all up together, the impact of these grants is enormous for UK PLC. And we were only quantifying the difference between 2, which was social services and housing. Now, I just wanted to finish in the last couple of minutes with just a sort of a story from the research. So we were going and talking to a lot of families with children with very challenging behavior, indeed, who had or who were waiting for disabled facilities grants. And there's one that sticks in my mind that I just wanted to very briefly mention. It was a council house. It was a very small council house for which an extension had been built at significant cost. And I was in the house talking to the mother. The son, who had autism and challenging behavior, was a very large lad, and he was pretty intimidating because of his behavior. He kept poking you or wanting to poke you in the eye and things like this. And his mother, who was not educated, but was sort of an incredible person, who had 3 menial jobs, whose English was a second language. She had coped, but she said she wouldn't have been able to cope if they hadn't had the extension, and the son would certainly have become looked after. And that was, she would have done everything to stop that happening, and he hadn't. But she was describing how before they had that extra space.
Luke, it's 15 minutes.
All right, I just want to finish this and then I'll be done. Before they'd had this,
I just want to know.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Sorry, Lorraine. Before they'd had that extra space, he had basically made life very difficult for everybody, particularly his younger sister, who he would sort of be very aggressive for. She was pretty well traumatized by this, particularly in the bathroom. If he wanted the bathroom and she was there, he would just kick the door down and throw her out. She couldn't have friends to the house. She was doing very badly. She was missing a lot of time off school, and on and on. And I was talking to the mother, and she was explaining how that had really changed a lot. And I trained as a scientist, and I'm interested in chemistry, and above the family table in this sort of very modest room, there was sort of pinned to the wall the periodic table. And I think the periodic table is magical, and I couldn't really stop looking at it. And eventually I had to say to the mother, what is that doing on the wall? And she obviously had no idea. She had no idea what it was. She said, oh, well, I don't know. I don't know what that is. It's to do with my daughter, the daughter who had been truanting, missing school, had been isolated. She said that since the adaptations have been done, she's just really blossomed at school. And she was doing her GCSEs. And she said, I don't know what that is, but I think it's to do with the GCSE, because she wants to be a doctor, and the school thinks that she may actually be able to qualify and become a doctor, because she wants to be able to care for people like her brother. And I think that's an extraordinary insight, an incredible story in a way, of the sort of unquantifiable benefits that you can't measure from disabled facilities grants. In that case, that you had to basically not only transform the young sibling's life, but you could imagine all the good that she would be able to do for sort of humankind, given the chance that this disabled facilities grant had given her. So I leave you with that.
Thank you very much, Luke. We've got lots of positive comments on the chat. I have got one question here. It says, does this duty to provide, even if the DFG doesn't cover, apply to children or also to adults?
Yeah, both. Well, the children, it's under the Chronic Disabled Persons Act, and adults, it's under the Care Act, 2014.
Fine, lovely, thank you. Thank you. Really positive comments. Thank you, fascinating. Thanks, Luke, very interesting. And the email address, I think a couple of people have actually asked the email address. Paul Smith has put the email address on the chat. And the other thing is that all the slides will be on YouTube. We're going to have separate videos, clips of each presenter. So I suppose if you look for Luke Clements and Foundations, it will be up there. Thank you, Luke, once again.